Welcome back. This is Christopher Neufeld of Neufeld Legal, your commercial leasing lawyer. In this particular YouTube video of our commercial leasing YouTube video series, we'll be looking at the two most prevalent forms of commercial leases, that being the triple net lease and the gross lease. So nowadays there's really two predominant ways that you're going to find lease arrangements on the commercial side, whether it's for a retail space, industrial space, a restaurant, office space. You're either going to find it where there is a larger, more substantial space, typically as a triple net lease, where the landlord is positioning themselves to transpose all the costs that they incur onto the tenant, and still somewhat available, although infrequently, and not necessarily with the larger commercial landlords unless it's a very small place, is the gross lease, where it's a one price, everything included lease arrangement. So what are you dealing with when you're getting into a triple net lease? In a triple net lease, you are getting involved with two basic elements of rent. And you got to be aware of this, that there's two elements to the rent. There's what's known as the base rent, which is the rent that you're going to consistently pay over the period of time, potentially with an escalator, and that's based on a square footage amount. That's negotiated at the outset, and it might be one rate for the first 2, 3, 4 years, then goes up a couple dollars a square foot over the next few years, and so on and so forth, till the end of the lease. Subsequently, if you have the lease extended or renewed, during the renewal period, typically there'll be a clause within the lease for the renewal that either the parties negotiate the new rate, or they use the fallback of what's the current commercial rate for comparable properties of that type for similar rent. So in this way, you're having a fixed amount of rent that's known. However, there's a second element to this process which tenants need to be aware of, and that's the additional rent. And the additional rent is where the landlord confers all the obligations that come onto the building, whether it's insurance, hydro, security, maintenance, upkeep, certain types of taxes, their administration, and the like, onto the tenant. And that can be a variable rate, but really it's a variable rate that only goes up for the tenant. So whenever there's cost increases, so let's say electricity goes up, security costs go up, insurance from the landlord's perspective go up, that cost is shifted from the landlord onto the tenant, then split proportionally amongst the various tenants, such that the landlord is not really picking up the costs associated with the increase, but he's just shifting them over to the tenant. And the way it works is you have all the tenants typically pooled together, all the costs are pooled together, and then they are split out amongst the various tenants based on a proportionate allocation. So if one tenant represents 10% of the space in the particular building, their share of the pooled additional rent will be 10% of that amount. So in fact, in a larger mall, for example, tenants might be ascribed 1%, even 0.5% of the full additional rent. The concern that the tenant has and should be aware of is that additional rent can get pretty pricey. Oftentimes it represents at the very outset of the lease arrangement only about an equivalent of maybe 1/2 to 2/3 or even 1/3 of what the base rent is. Nevertheless, over time, because insurance rates can go up rapidly, various taxes can go up, other costs can go up, needs for repairing the parking lot are shifted onto the clients, the tenants, so that very quickly, year over year, the additional rent can go up. And oftentimes what I found in my legal practice, and I've had to push my clients to do, is as tenants, is to find out what the additional rent is at the outset. Because all too often, the client is negotiating with the landlord, and they know what the base rent is, but they have no idea what the additional rent is. And it can be significant, especially when you're looking at budgeting. And even being provided with the last 2 years of additional rent as calculated and pushed out by the landlord to its previous tenants will be highly beneficial. You need to know those numbers, because then you can understand what the expectations are and properly factor in the fact that those numbers are going to go up year over year. So there is that variable element that you have to understand and be aware of and deal with before you commit to a lease and when you negotiate, because otherwise you're going to be in for some very serious sticker shock during the first year when the additional rent payments are coming due and when the additional rent adjustment comes due. Because you got to remember, they might have a preset range of payments that they expect you to pay, but if the actual additional rent that the landlord has incurred over the course of the year is more than what they had predicted, they're simply going to push it off to the tenant, meaning you, the newcomer to the business. So you got to be aware of that. And another interesting thing that you should be aware of, and there's not much tenants can do, is the ever-expanding scope of administrative charges that are included in additional rent. Some 10, 15 years ago, when we first were dealing with commercial leasing on a substantial basis, I bore witness to the change when there really was no administrative charge included in commercial leases, especially the commercial leases from the larger commercial landlords. But slowly, starting off with a 5% charge, commercial landlords, since they have the power and people want to be in their particular buildings, have slowly added in and increased charges for administration that were previously part of the whole cost structure. Now, from a 5% charge to a 10% charge to a typical 15% charge that one sees, and other alternate charges that are tacked on top of that, the landlords are trying to create additional profit centers for themselves and additional charges so that you have a base rent that we talked about that you negotiate, but then you find yourselves with additional rent and an administrative charge that's based on what the additional rent is outside of that charge, such that you can find yourself paying a very pretty penny on top of what the actual costs that are being incurred by the landlord. So be aware of what you need to tackle when it comes to a triple net lease, or you're going to be in for some really serious sticker shock when you start seeing the bills coming in. On a comparative note, there is still in certain circumstances what's known as a gross lease. Not really available with the larger commercial landlords unless there's a very particular situation Because what a gross lease does is it sets a single price for the monthly rent, and that is an all-inclusive price. So what you'll find is you'll get a number, let's say $1,000 a month, and that just does that would include what a triple net lease would have as both base rent and additional rent. There might be a few minor carve-outs like maybe hydro and water, but typically all the other aspects involved in the lease where the landlord is paying directly to whether insurance providers for their insurance, property management, security, certain types of taxes, they are not going to be subsequently shifted onto the tenant, but are simply previously factored in by the landlord, borne by the landlord, and drawn from the gross lease monthly payment to cover that cost. So if there's a substantial increase in those costs, the lease payments do not change. This is very beneficial to tenants because it gives them a lot more certainty as to what their cost is going to be month over month, year over year. However, it is very infrequent. Like I said, the larger commercial landlords don't give these kind of lease arrangements out unless they're probably very small properties and or very short-term periods, and they're just trying to get somebody in there and hopefully maintain the place until they can get what they're really looking for. Instead, they typically involve smaller landlords who are willing to put in place particular arrangements and are not as profit driven as the large commercial landlords who try to make sure everything is covered and pushed out, and therefore not have to be concerned about high fluctuations that they haven't covered and eating into their margins. Nevertheless, as a new tenant, you're probably going to have to expect that you're going to be signing off on a triple net lease. And with a triple net lease, you have to address some of the concerns that I've addressed in this particular YouTube video, as well as other concerns and points of note that I will look to address in future YouTube videos on commercial leasing. Thank you.